I had a great and lively talk before I came into the hotel with your pickets out there. Did you see the pickets? With signs? Homophobes? So I went out there, parked my car, and before I came into the hotel, I went out there and started chatting with them. And 3 of them are ordained ministers. One is a counselor, and I'm not sure what the others were. But we engaged in a very lively conversation. I said, what's all of this about? And they said, the people inside are causing suicides by telling people they can change. And when they find out they can't, they commit suicide. And what they're doing is, they're underscoring by saying you can change, they're underscoring the concept that being gay is bad. So I talked with them, and I said, well, what if somebody wants to change? Oh, no, it's impossible. You cannot change. This is immutable. So the conversation went on like this. Finally, somebody got around to asking me, what is your name? And I said, Dr. Nicholas Cummings. And this counselor says, I know you. You were president of the APA. What are you doing in there? And I said, I'm going to be speaking to the group. Silence. Silence. They said, well, you should know that people cannot change their sexual orientation. And I said, how do I know that? Well, you're a therapist. And I said, you know, let me tell you something. I was chief of mental health for Kaiser Permanente in the 1960s and 1970s during the gay revolution. San Francisco overnight became a gay city, and also a lesbian city a few years later. Some interesting things melded. I wrote the first prepaid, extensive, comprehensive psychotherapy contract for Kaiser Permanente in 1959. Up until that time, psychotherapy was an absolute written exclusion. Your health insurance policy said, this insurance does not include, and up at the top would be psychotherapy. So all of a sudden, the 4.5 million members of the Kaiser Health Plan in Northern California were eligible to receive psychotherapy. And a very large percentage of those were gays and lesbians because of the influx into San Francisco almost overnight. So we didn't see hundreds, we didn't see thousands, we saw tens of thousands of gay and lesbian patients over the next 20 years. So I said to these people out, your pickets out front, I said, you know, I saw change. I said, no, you must have imagined it. So anyway, we parted with their shaking my hand and said, well, we appreciate your talking to us. And I said, I appreciate your talking to me, but I'm going to tell the folks inside about our conversation. And I said, I hope that you are glad that they are in there, just as you're glad you're out here, because we need open dialogue. What we don't need is you're telling me that it is impossible to change one's sexual orientation. Heredity. You know, the APA has sort of softened its approach a little bit, but for years it held that sexual orientation was hardwired and could not be changed. How many of you have heard of epigenetics? Good for you. We know now the genes are not yes or no. The genes do not hold traits or do not hold traits. We do not believe anymore that DNA can only go in one direction, that there's this junk out there called RNA that nobody knows what it's supposed to be doing out there, but it's there and it's a bunch of junk. No, we find out now that RNA triggers what the gene does. It's called epigenetics. And the area that genes cover, the epigenes, are 50 times the size of the area that is covered by the genes. 50 times greater. What determines what the epigenes do? What you do with your life. If, you know, we used to blame the mother. Anything hereditary comes from the mother. Men got off scot-free. Well, since they were writing the rules, I can see why they came to that conclusion. But now we know that if the father was a heavy marijuana smoker and altered his genes, that alteration is going to appear in the genes of his children. Lo and behold, we went from hardwiring to environmental influences. And you know, I remember many years ago, I'm 88 now, but I can still remember when I was in Sunday school. I was taught the sins of the father are unto the third and fourth generation. We knew more 4,000 years ago than we knew 2 years ago in science. How many of you have heard of neutrinos? Not neutrons, neutrinos. Good for you. Pardon? What are neutrinos? Neutrinos are the smallest particles discovered in the universe. They can be measured, but they cannot be seen because they are so small that we do not have an optic that will bring them up. They travel at just slightly below the speed of light. They come from millions of light years in outer space, which, interestingly enough, physics says, you know, it's an amazing thing now. We know from neutrinos that come from millions of years out of space that matter is consistent no matter where it is. 1 trillion neutrinos go through your body every second. Every second. 1 trillion with a T. The only other thing that I can think of that travels that fast is the federal budget. Why do we know more about neutrinos than we know about sexual orientation? The answer is very simple. Political correctness is not impinging on neutrinos or epigenetics, but it is paramount when it comes to sexual orientation. I want to remind us that the 2 decades I'm going to talk about, gay and lesbian orientation was the majority. San Francisco had changed overnight. So we're not talking now about a minority, we're talking about the majority. So what happened in those 20 years where my many, many psychotherapists, they were all psychologists or social workers, because back in the 1960s and 70s, they were the only two professions that were licensed. Counselors, MFTs, so forth, were not licensed that early, so we used only psychologists and social workers. And we had scores and scores of them, because we were treating a 4.5 million population. The gay and lesbian community, when I first took office, was criminalized. It was illegal to have homosexual sex. And there were many arrests. And as the gay and lesbian population began to migrate to San Francisco, there were more and more violations and lots of arrests. And the desire of many men to go in drag was illegal to go in drag except on Halloween night. If you went in drag, you could be arrested. And then the courts ruled that the law was based on the intent to deceive. So if you wore a badge, if you dressed like a woman, you wore a badge that said, "I am a boy," you could go around in drag. Criminalization was not the answer. Many violations. I was opposed to criminalization. But then we went in the other direction. We flip-flopped. And laws were passed that not only allowed people to cross-dress, but you could not be fired for cross-dressing at work. So suddenly we had so many of the women lawyers on Montgomery Street going to work in men's suits and ties and carrying briefcases. And we had men going to work in dresses. And it got to the point where the chief of police wore a dress to the office every day. And then he was followed by the fire marshal, who would come to work dressed as a woman. We went from criminalization to ridiculousness. Didn't make any sense, but that's what was happening. Excuse me. So what did our patients come to see us for? There was a tremendous influx as people migrated to San Francisco. The first reaction was, I think I died and went to heaven. They couldn't get over the openness of what was going on in the community. This began to change because the nightlife and the culture in San Francisco became unbelievable in a very short time. Gay bars proliferated. I don't know how many there were ultimately, but one bar owner sold 34 of his gay bars and bought the town of Gurneyville on the Russian River and turned it into a gay resort. One man owned 34 gay bars, and that was only a fraction of the number of gay bars there were in the city of San Francisco. The bars were of all types. There were leather bars, and one bar, the men would go into the bar wearing just chaps. Now, you know what chaps are? Cowboy chaps. They're built to go over your jeans. So there's no crotch, either front or in the back. So that's what they would wear. So essentially, they would be in this bar naked. Perfectly acceptable. There were motorcycle bars. We had a huge community spring up called Dykes on Bikes. I don't mean to offend anybody by using first-order words, but I can tell you that in the gay community in San Francisco in the 1970s and 80s, first-order words were prevalent. If a gay man wanted to disparage another man, he'd say, oh, he's a faggot. And if he were particularly effeminate, he was called a Nelly faggot. These were from gays, not from the outside. First-order words were prevalent for very, very masculine women. Words like dagger, bull dyke were common. Cross-dressing became very common. I remember one day I was driving to work and a car ran a stoplight and rammed me. And we were out there exchanging driver's licenses with this man who looked like he was in his 40s. And I looked at his driver's license. I said, this isn't your license. This says Rita. And this voice says, this very masculine voice says, I'm Rita. This was very, very common in San Francisco. You couldn't tell the girls from the boys. Also in San Francisco at that time, there was a psychologist named Donald Clark, Dr. Donald Clark. Have any of you heard of Don Clark? No. It's interesting because in the early 1960s, Don wrote the first gay book by a psychologist that was titled Living Gay. And it became a bestseller in the gay community. And Don was a friend of mine. And in fact, when Don and Barbara, his wife, first came to San Francisco, they stayed in our home for about 3 weeks before they found an apartment. And I used to talk to Don quite a bit, and he used to give me what was going on in the gay community politically and so forth. He was very frank about it. He's a very, very, very nice gentleman, by the way, who later divorced Barbara, and he married a man named Dr. Michael Graves, another psychologist, and they've been together for about 30 years, 25 years perhaps. So at that time, I was very well placed to see what was happening in the community, not only because I was Chief of Mental Health for Kaiser Permanente, but I was on the mental health board of the City and County of San Francisco. I was re-elected to 5 four-year terms. So I was always there knowing what was happening and what the laws that were passed. We had, it was difficult during those years to go into a men's room, and if you had to go into a stall, not to find a glory hole. Do all of you know what a glory hole is? Some of you do. A hole would be cut in the partition to the toilet next to you. And lo and behold, suddenly a naked penis would appear in that hole and you were supposed to perform oral sex. This was absolutely the epitome of anonymous sex. You never saw the person you had sex with because they were in the other partition, beyond the other side. The gay community, when sexual activity was totally open, accepted, and the predominant mode, anonymous sex became a fetish. People would go out seeking anonymous sex. Buena Vista Park was a place where gays would go seeking sex during the day. And it was a sure thing because everybody there was there for the same purpose. I remember one patient told me that somebody kept calling him and he couldn't figure out where he was. Suddenly he looked up and the man was in the tree. So he climbed the tree and they had sex up inside the tree. And this was considered, wow, what an experience. Okay. I don't mean to offend, but we're using first order words that were in the gay community. Do you know what a piss tub is? There were bars that had bathtubs, 4 or 5 of them. And someone could sit in there and anybody who wanted to would come up and urinate on them. It's very popular. In those days, you did not have the internet with the tremendous pornography that we now find on the internet. You had to go to porn shows. And there were these porn shows that were booths with a door. And you would look into an instrument and you'd see the film showing various pornographic acts. That was just a place to be, because you would be in there and somebody would enter and perform anal sex on you and then leave, and you'd never know who it was. These were very popular. Are any of you surprised? So we began to see patients, gay and lesbian, who were revulsed by what was going on in San Francisco. They wanted a more stable, even, loving life. We had danger. There was an abandoned railroad tunnel in the Mission District where the train tracks were. That was about maybe 200 yards long. And the lights had many years ago been turned off, and people would walk in there in pitch dark, and you'd run into somebody, and you'd grope each other. And then you'd go on and you'd run into somebody else and you'd grope each other. And I would say to my patients, you know, that can be dangerous. You can't see it all in there. There may be somebody who's violent. Well, sure enough, it wasn't long before somebody was knifed and killed in that tunnel. And this was headlines on the San Francisco Chronicle. So what do you think happened? The number of people going into that tunnel at night quadrupled. Quadrupled. There were many more knifings and people being beat up, and finally the city, in desperation, strung lights through there, and that stopped the activity. So we saw a lot of patients who were revulsed by this behavior. It is not innate to same-sex orientation to be that profligate. But when you create an environment where it becomes glamorous to be promiscuous and to be in danger, somehow it becomes enticing. We saw patients who could never have sex with the same person twice. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I remember one patient who came to see us in a panic state. His first appointment, he came in on a drop-in in a panic state because he was having sex with a man, and this man called him Fred. And he said, "How did you know my name?" He said, "We had sex about 3 months ago, don't you remember?" And this man went into a panic state because he could never have sex with the same person twice. What does this mean to you psychologically? Doesn't it indicate to you that there's something disdainful about what you're doing? That you can't face the same person twice? That this is totally devoid of affection, communication, psychological contact? And so we began to see gay and lesbian patients in droves. I want to say right now that the lesbian community was not as flagrant as the gay community, but it had its own flagrancies. And there were a number of lesbian bars in San Francisco. And there was a whole community in the Mission District where you absolutely could not tell these women from men. They were so masculine in their actual bringing about masculinity as much as they could, even to the point of putting medications on your face that would grow hair, so that they would grow a beard. So patients began to come to us, and we had a huge population of patients that used to come to us to help them achieve a more sane homosexual life. And we honored that. Secondly, we had patients who were breaking up with a lover. That was probably the second biggest population of gays and lesbians. Most gay relationships would last about 90 days, which by my calculation is 18 more days than Kim Kardashian. And they would be distraught. And they would come to us, and very often this would be the third or fourth or fifth such situation for them. These gay relationships did not last long. Everybody was looking for the right man. And I used to kid my patients, and I say, you know, in your attempts to find the right man, you've determined that you will sleep with every man in San Francisco. Because if you don't sleep with everybody, you'll never know if you found the right man. And they would laugh at that and then say, you know, you got a point, doctor. Then we started to get gay patients who wanted to change. They had a religious or cultural background where they were taught that this was not the way to live. And they'd been caught up in the environment that was San Francisco at that time, and they came to the point where they said, I can't do this anymore. and they wanted to change. How did we address this? We would be very straightforward. We would test the limit. We would tell them this is very difficult. There may be one chance in 100, or maybe even one chance in 1,000. If anything, we'd go overboard the other way to discourage them. If, on the other hand, they were determined to change, we honored that. And we addressed that. As I told your pickets out in front, when they told me that this can't change, I said we saw not one, not two, not three, but hundreds who changed. The recidivism was frequent along the way. They would backslide. But we were used to that because you have that if you're treating substance abuse. The number of times an alcoholic may fall off the wagon before he or she goes clean may be quite a bit before they finally find the answer to the way they want to live. And so we were quite successful for those who were determined. Now, where we saw tens of thousands of patients who didn't want to change, who wanted a more happy homosexual life, the number that came to us for change were a small fraction. But as Ronald Reagan said, never say never. And the stance that this can never change, all you have to do is see one person change and it knocks down that victim. We saw hundreds change and achieve very happy heterosexual lives. We had many women who had gravitated to a lesbian orientation but wanted to change for the sake of the children and to save their marriages. And we honored that. Now, I want to tell you, change was easier for women than it was for the men. Much easier. We had much more success with women than we did with men. But of those that we were determined to change and stuck with it, we had over half of the ones who started who achieved their goal. The other kind of patient we saw was gay men in a long-term relationship that were having trouble and were breaking up. And interestingly, we treated it the same way that heterosexual married couples who were breaking up. We would look to see what they really wanted. And you know, there's a dead giveaway. If a man and a woman say they can't stand each other, they must have a divorce, but they've been fighting for the last 5.5 months over who gets the toaster, that is a sure sign that they don't want to break up. They're using the stupid toaster as a way to prevent a divorce. We use these same criteria with our gay couples and our lesbian couples. The cesspool that became San Francisco suddenly changed. What changed it? AIDS! Suddenly there was this disease. But let me back up. Before AIDS, syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant in the gay community. Rampant. And public health would follow up. And if you reported to get treatment for syphilis or gonorrhea, you were interviewed, who was your sexual contact? And that sexual contact would be sought out by the public health service and also treated. Do you know when HIV was discovered, that stopped? That stopped? For a year and a half, testing the blood supply for HIV because they were afraid that people would come to the conclusion that AIDS was a homosexual disease, which it was. It was at that time. There were very few people outside the gay community that had AIDS. Civil rights topped health and welfare. The baths. The baths were absolutely an unbelievable phenomenon in San Francisco. People would go to the baths, and in one evening they might have contact with a dozen other men. It was a perfect spreading ground for AIDS. The Public Health Department of San Francisco tried to close it down. I know, because I was on the mental health board and I voted for it. It was declared a civil rights issue, and the baths remained open. Then what did we start to get? People with AIDS. People dying of AIDS. So we're doing death and dying therapy, which is very, very difficult if you've ever done it. It's no picnic. But the gay and lesbian community in San Francisco began to grow up. San Francisco itself has not. I love that city. I practiced there for 40 years. But recently, they're banning goldfish and circumcision. A city ordinance saying that it's cruel to have goldfish in a bowl, therefore goldfish are outlawed. And circumcision is brutal. But what happens to the religious rights of those religions that require circumcision? Well, that doesn't matter. You know, religion is old-fashioned anyway. Day before yesterday, San Francisco passed a law saying you could not dine in a public restaurant naked. Day before yesterday. Why did they do that? Because a large proportion of the population found it fun to go dining every evening naked, stark naked. Why did they finally ban it? Because tourists stopped going to dinner in San Francisco. This was offensive. So, I hate to say it, but San Francisco still hasn't grown up. I'm very sad that the whole issue now has become a matter of political correctness. I long for the day that we can do honest, open research. Right now, funding organizations cherry pick the research that's funded. If you do certain research and get certain outcomes, you will submit it to 20 journals and be turned down by 20 journals because it is not politically correct. What I hope to see, and because the APA has become a monolith, and how did that happen? There are about 200 to 250 people in APA that rotate among all the offices of the APA. You do your term in one office and you run for another one. You do your term there and you run for another one. And so there are about 200 to 250 people. We actually did a factorial analysis of the names of the office because, you know, they're published every year. And we did it for year after year after year. There's a hard core of between 200 and 250 that run APA. And all the rest of us, all we have the right to do is once a year we vote for president. So what I look for is what happened, for example, in the African American community. An indigenous internal thrust of African American leaders that began to speak out. And the slogan, "Don't have children till you're married, marry, get a job, and keep it," became a cry in the African American community. Internally, it could not be solved from the outside. And I believe maybe the gay and lesbian issue will eventually, at some point, there will be an intelligent group of gays and lesbians who say, enough already, let's really look at what the scientific research says. And that it will grow out from internally. I hope so. I hope so. I'm now 88, I should live so long, but I do hope to see it. Okay, I want to open this to questions from the floor. Do we have some time? Yes, sir. Yeah, the declaration that homosexuality should be taken out of the DSM was rendered by the American Psychiatric Association by vote of its membership. You're all aware of that? Okay, consider now if something like pancreatic cancer diagnosis we left up to a vote. I mean, the idea that diagnosis and treatment is subject to an election. What kind of science is this? Because political correctness prevailed. Now, I must confess that in 1975, I introduced a motion in the Council of Representatives of the APA that homosexuality was not a disease. And it passed. And I still believe that it's not a disease. But it is a birth anomaly. That is the situation that you're born in. We found, for example, that masculine-appearing men who had been seduced at a boyish age of, say, 8 or 9 or 10 by an older man were more amenable to psychotherapy and change than boys brought up by 2 women living together who were dressed in dresses starting at the age of 2 or 3. They were hard. Environment has everything to do with this, as epigenetics is showing us. But there are degrees of implantation and resistance to change, and there are issues that facilitate change. But we can't get to those. We can't separate those and do hard science and say which is which, because everything is subject to political correctness. Another question? Yes, sir. You know, my question is, if this is hereditary, how do we know it isn't something like pathological, like Down syndrome? You know, that's hereditary too. So you know, they can get impaled on their own petard. But no, the APA does not look into environmental causes of homosexuality. They believe it's something that's immutable, it's appropriate, it's permissible, it's acceptable, end of period. You mean a totally healthy? Now, it depends, you know, what healthy is. That we've had many patients that were involved in homosexual activity because they were terrified of women. And when they became more comfortable with women, they lost their desire for sex with men. So, you know, there are all kinds of environmental things. But I do believe that we're talking about environment. We're talking about the effect of epigenes on the genes, turning off or on. Think of it this way. Think of the genes as your computer and the epigenes as the program. Can you follow that? So regardless of what your computer says, your program determines what's going to come out. And the program, is what I'm standing here for, is the environment. Yes, sir. Oh, very simply. It was not a random experiment. Now, it was a naturalistic experiment. I mean, a naturalistic experiment of that magnitude to any scientist is prevailing. You know, if you have an epidemic like the 1918 flu that killed millions and millions of people, you don't have to have a scientific controlled experiment to prove that that flu virus kills people. But the APA dismisses it because, oh no, this was nothing more than experience. Ideology is not penetrable. When you have an ideological position, that's it. Yes, sir. The response to destructive trends in mental health, the well-intentioned path to harm, the first response was that Rhea Farberman, the information officer for the APA, immediately sent an email to all of the journals, and the APA owns 28 journals. Most people don't realize that, but 28 journals. Sent an instruction to all of the APA journals that this book was not to be reviewed. It's a nice open response, right? The book, Destructive Trends in Mental Health, and along with a sequel to it called 11 Blunders That Cripple Psychotherapy in America, is getting a lot of attention, both of them. Not in APA. What is happening to APA is that it's losing membership drastically. Drastically. So the people in APA who might change the organization are leaving it in disgust. And that's that lessens the possibility the APA would change. Yes? Well, I'm still a member of APA. That's because I've reached the age where I don't have to pay dues. So, at any rate, I don't know. People have tried to change APA and they're leaving in disgust. So, unfortunately, what it means is there'll be less and less people left in the APA that would be the ones that would change the APA. Yeah, I think you had your hand up first. Well, I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know that anybody's ever canvassed it, but I presume it's a pretty sizable majority. I had an experience way back when the migration of gays and lesbians to San Francisco began. I was picketed, told that I had to hire a gay or lesbian psychologist. And my response was, well, I already have, but I respect their right to stay in the closet if they so choose. And of course, nobody believed me. So I think in 1959, I hired the first openly gay psychologist. His name was Dr. Dennis Sedgley. Dennis turned out to be a wonderful asset. Well, 2 days after I hired Dennis, 5 of my other psychologists came out. So we had gay and lesbian psychologists on our staff. We didn't discriminate. But you know, the interesting thing is that because we were approaching this honestly and straightforwardly, there were no differences in the way we approached patients. And it was not long after I hired Denny Sedgley, it turns out that the gay patients who came to us never asked whether you were gay or not. They didn't differentiate. They trusted all of us because we approached the matter straightforwardly. Oh, yes, absolutely. The findings that there's more pathology among gays and lesbians, more alcoholism, more drug abuse among gays and lesbians, is dismissed by saying, yes, because they're being persecuted by the general population. That's still pretty much the dictum. You know, I said that to our friends out in the picket line earlier this afternoon. And they said, oh, yes, that may have been so, but they were subject to years of discrimination before they moved to San Francisco. You know, there's an answer to anything if you've already made up your mind what the answer should be. Sure. Yes, sir. It has impact on people who've left the APA. And, you know, I have an absolutely beautiful letter from Joe Lieberman, Senator Joe Lieberman, telling me that Destructive Trends in Mental Health is required reading for everybody on his staff. And when a new staff member is hired, that staff member is obligated to read Destructive Trends in Mental Health the first week he or she is there. So it's had an impact on outside the APA, and it has had an impact on inside of APA, mostly to the people that are not running the AP. The 200 to 250 that run it, no, it's had no impact whatsoever. So you're talking about the bias in graduate schools toward anyone who believes that gays can be changed. Well, what I would like to see someday is an organization like this get up a war chest and sue. I'm serious. This is a reverse violation of civil rights. There have been lots of students that have been dropped out of program, and I'm sure all of you know about the case of Arthur Code at the University of Pennsylvania, that was a very, very liberal counselor and minister who had a program on the family. And he was in a doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was thrown out because if you are for the family, it means you're anti-gay. And he was thrown out of the program. In most instances, it doesn't get to that because the students are terrified. They don't speak up. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have sued the American Psychiatric Association 4 times and have won all 4 times. Twice I tried to sue the American Psychological Association and they backed down, so I couldn't sue them. I'm going to say something that you're all going to be mad at me about. But darn it, if we're going to confront this issue, we've got to have balls. Thank you.